My name is Dr. Charles Strong. I lived in Crawfordsville, a small community in northwest Crawford County. I wanted to buy a lot and build a drugstore there, but the city fathers told me no. So I decided to start my own town and went looking for the geographic center of the county. On February 28, 1868, my 40th birthday, I saddled up my horse Bob and headed out. After riding for a while through the tall prairie grass, a deer sprang up, and I killed it. After looking around, I decided this was going to be the location of my new town. I named it Girard after my hometown back in Pennsylvania. There's varying accounts about Girard's growth, but in July 1868, I counted 3 stores and 6 houses. My drugstore on the northwest corner was the first. It remained there until 1890 when Charles Phillips purchased the corner and tore my store down in order to build his own drugstore. Another early store was the Pioneer Store on the southwest corner of the square. It was a general store founded by Nelson Sennett in 1868. Later, it would be a hardware store, then JCPenney, Burnham Auto Parts, and now Bumper to Bumper Auto Parts. Just to the east of the Pioneer Store, a man named Franklin Plater built this building. It was the city's first brick building and was built in 1873. It was the State Bank of Girard, and it still stands today, although it's no longer a bank. It was the predecessor of the First National Bank of Girard. Mr. Plater later founded the city of Pittsburgh. The First National Bank, founded in 1884, was next housed in a 2-story red brick building with a round tower just to the north of the square. The structure survived for 80 years from 1898 to 1978 before moving to its present location on the southwest corner of the square. The Girard National Bank opened in 1918. Earl Schifferdecker came to work here in 1925 as a bookkeeper. It was known as the Farmers and Miners Bank then. In 1929, it became Girard National Bank. Earl was succeeded by his son Martin, and now his grandson Mark. As the town grew and stores filled the square, it wasn't uncommon for them to be constantly relocating. Stores on the west moved to the east, and those on the north moved to the south. There were grocers, dry goods, millinery shops, meat markets, livery stables, restaurants, and a lot of others. Too many to mention. The Girard Press was originally known as the Fort Scott Press when it moved to Girard in 1869. Not too long after, the paper was burned to the ground by some settlers who were upset with the stand the paper had taken over land titles. A new building was erected on the north side of the square where the paper was published until 1920. It then moved to the west side of the square until it ceased publication in 2009. Though some of the buildings on the square are the very same buildings that were built back in the first years of Girard's founding, many other buildings have long since been torn down and replaced. For instance, the square used to be home to several 3-story buildings. The only remaining one is this one, the Cadwell Building, originally built in 1886. Many of the first buildings not present on the square were homes and churches. As far as well-known structures go, one would be hard-pressed to find any in Girard more influential than the Raymonds. J.E. Raymond himself was one of Girard's founding fathers, and he and his family are behind some of Girard's main landmarks. Foremost of these is the Raymond Community Home, constructed in 1893 for Raymond's first wife, Lottie Cadwell. It was heralded by the town as a triumph of construction. Unfortunately, his wife Lottie wasn't able to enjoy her new home for long, as she passed away soon after its completion. Upon the death of Mr. Raymond himself, ownership passed to his second wife, Mary E. Winston. Mary retained ownership of the home until 1932, at which point she transferred it to the city. She can also be thanked for Winston Park, named after her maiden name, along with the fairgrounds and Crawford Hills Golf Course. All 160 acres of the 2 locations were deeded to the city in 1931. There are a handful of other historic homes in the city which can rival the history of the Raymond Community Home, and this home is one of them. Though there is no record of exactly when work began on the home, construction was definitely underway in 1907. Though it was built to be a private residence of J.T. Leonard, the president of what would become the First National Bank, and his wife, the two were noted socialites and ensured that it would be shared with the Girard community. As you can see, the home is quite frankly enormous, the largest ever constructed in Girard. It encompasses 9,600 square feet, required 3,000 pounds of nails to complete during its initial construction, and needed more than 100 gallons of paint to cover its exterior when it was renovated in 2016. Over its lifespan, the home has served in a multitude of roles, from a private home to a funeral home to a bed and breakfast and back to a private residence. The Presbyterian Church was completed in 1887 after its previous building was destroyed by a tornado. It was completed just a few months before this one, the Episcopal Church. It was built between 1886 and 1888 and is currently in the process of being renovated and remodeled for the new Girard History Museum, thanks to the Friends of Historic Girard. Terry Harley is the museum president. Another group of homes built in Girard was part of the Higgy Addition.
The Higgy Addition is in our northwest part of town, and it was started by the Higgy family. They came here, they were shipbuilders up in the Great Lakes, and they moved here in the early 1800s, well, in the middle 1800s, and they built beautiful homes. There was originally 5 homes that were built, and out of that I think we only have 3 standing now. And but they built they purchased a large part of the city up there. There was actually had Higgy Lakes and a lot of area, and they shipped in their lumber and the different items for their homes from back east, and they were considered some of the most stately homes in town.
The J.A. Whalen home on North Summit, originally constructed as another Higgy home, was completed in 1887. Though Whalen didn't purchase the home until 1896, it was his status as the editor to the Appeal to Reason newspaper which made him and his home famous.
J.A. Whalen was a socialist. He was born in Indiana, was raised in abject poverty, lost a lot of his family to cholera, and as a young boy got a job with a newspaper, and he began to love the work and did very well and began to prosper in it. He moved, his wife Etta had some health issues and they were living north, and he decided to move to Girard after coming through here, and seeing the city, he just felt like it was a place that they could really enjoy and raise their family. And so he built the building there on that corner, and it was originally the Appeal to Reason building, and he started publishing newspapers. And at one time he had the largest printing presses that were west of the Mississippi brought in, and they would print the newspaper. It was a socialist paper, a weekly paper, and would leave Girard with 750 tons shipped out every week. And because he had so much mail going out through the rail station, we were able to receive a first-class post office.
The Appeal to Reason building was on the northeast corner of the square when J.A. Whalen committed suicide in his home in 1912.
Later, the building was in the hands of Warren, which was his right-hand man, Fred Warren. And in 1915, they brought in Emanuel Haldeman Joyce. When Emanuel Haldeman Joyce decided to come to Girard, it was on an invitation from Fred Warren. Actually, he had met someone from Girard when he was in New York City, and that was Marcette Haldeman. She had come back to Girard to help her mother. Her father was a doctor and passed away, and so she knew Emanuel Joyce also. And an invitation went out, and he accepted to come and to begin work with the Appeal to Reason. As time went on, though, he wanted to expand that into more, and he began to see the need for a book that would get information out to people, but it needed to be affordable. This would have been in the early 1900s. Times were tight. You had the Depression, and he would begin publishing the Appeal to Reason, but he changed the name to the American Freedman because he changed party politics from Socialist to Democrat. And he started publishing the little blue books. And they were just a little 3.5 by 2 book, and it was what they considered a pocket series, and it would fit in the pocket of your shirt. and they were shipped out all over the United States, all over the world. But the biggest markets were California and New York, Chicago, and down in Texas, being the fact that in California, a lot of them were sold right there as you'd get on the trolley cars, and people could read them. They could pick them up for a quick read and for a nickel a book. Girard had a real strong socialist history. We have a co-op, which at that time was considered socialist. We have the Heartland Rural Electric. We have also the Crocan Telephone is a socialist type of business. There were several this way that influence of the socialists had on our community. Many socialists visited Girard during the time of Emanuel, Holden Julius, and J.A. Wayland. We had Mother Jones, who was fighting for those that were working in the coal industry. We had Upton Sinclair, who was investigating the meat industry. The meat packing industry was very vile at that time. Eugene V. Debs came to Girard and declared his candidacy on the north side of our courthouse steps. We had just, there were different painters. Walkowitz was a socialist that came and was painting art at that time and would stay here in Girard. So with that, we brought in a lot of different people. Osha and Martin Johnston were the African explorers, and they were out of Chinook, Kansas. They were guests here. So we just had a lot of activity coming in on the railroad, visiting.
In 1908, Henry Lawrence Call arrived in Girard with the blueprints for a flying machine. A group of Girard businessmen immediately agreed to finance the venture.
Henry Lawrence Call was also a socialist and was attracted to Girard because of the socialist history and the socialist activity that was going on. So he came here with an idea to build an airplane. And actually he did. He started an airplane factory. And in 1908, they had a plane that weighed 3,000 pounds. It was supposed to take a delegation of, I think, 8 men to Chicago to the socialist meeting that they were having. And he christened it the Great Dream. But the town folk, and particularly the Girard press at that time, just thought it was a joke, and they called it the Mayfly. And so it was kind of an ongoing little feud there between the two. They did get the plane out of town, and it ran, but it never took off of the ground, so it didn't fly. But after that, he did build smaller planes, and he did actually get them in the air. So technically, again, Girard had the first airplane factory west of the Mississippi, right here. And because of that, Lindbergh, he flew over Girard. In 1927, he dropped a scroll and congratulating Girard for having an airplane factory here in Girard, Kansas.
Another historic site in Girard is this old ice house and what we now know as Crocker's Lake.
James McFarland, back in, I think it was 1884, 86, somewhere in there, built a block building, rock building, very much like our church, the museum, and he decided that the ice boxes were at that time where we were able to keep things cold. So he dammed up a street and built a little lake, and with that lake he was able to cut ice. He would ship it up into the top of the building and back down, and they would stack that ice in hay to keep it cold. And then he had a horse and buggy, and actually I think we have one of the, it's really a cart here in the museum, and he would deliver ice from house to house.
The courthouse itself isn't even one of the square's original structures, even though today it is Girard's most recognizable building. The square was originally a field of prairie grass. Over the years, multiple buildings served as our courthouse, some on the square and some surrounding it. A multi-story brick courthouse was built in 1889, but it didn't stand up well and was razed in 1920. The current courthouse was built in 1922 and is still going strong. The economy of Girard has always been based largely on farming. Soon after Girard's founding in 1868, areas all around the city were being fenced and cultivated. There were all kinds of field crops, and most farmers had a dairy cow or two.
Beasley Farm, as it's known, was established in 1893. Captain William Beasley moved here from Iowa. He married young lady named Anna Fawcett, and they had 4 sons, which would have been my grandfather and his 3 brothers. One of them was Roy Clinton. They called him Pat. He was my grandfather. And I had an Uncle George, who would have been an uncle. Those are the only 2 that settled here in Girard. The rest of them moved on. But my grandfather, my grandfather had the vision to start a registered Holstein herd, along with sheep, pigs, stock cows, chickens and stuff. And from that registered Holstein herd, I think that's how the farm remained and got established. Over the time, he sold the sheep and sold the stock cows and sold the pigs, but we always kept the dairy. So we've been in the dairy business for a long, long time. They bottled milk back in the day. I used to get to see the old equipment, and I can remember them telling stories about when they were building Farthington Lake with the CCC camp. They would deliver milk from there to them, and they would also deliver bottled milk in town. My dad used to tell stories about how he used to do that. I think in the 40s, when they came out with the plastic cartons, is kind of when they ceased bottling milk anymore. But it was kind of neat to see some of the old equipment that they had back in the day.
The Girard Library was built in 1906 with funds donated by Andrew Carnegie. Alice Haldeman helped make it happen. Alice's sister, Jane Addams, was the founder of Hull House in Chicago, a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a friend of Carnegie's. She, along with a local attorney, was able to secure $8,000 to build the library, all with the pledge that the city would maintain it. Girard, it was said, was the smallest community in the world to have a Carnegie Library. This was the home of one of Girard's earliest settlers, Captain J.D. Barker. His mansion was notable for its tower, which swept 42 feet into the air above the city. It would later serve as our town's first hospital before it was closed in 1916, when the post office was built on this site. A new hospital was built in 1918 at the corner of Forest and Carbon. The Central School had burned at this location 2 years earlier in 1960. That hospital and its expansion served the city until a new, more modern hospital was constructed west of town in 1969. Girard's first school was built in 1869. It served until a new brick school was built at the present location of the high school in 1873. A new South School was built as well, later to become Emerson Elementary. A third school called Central School was built at the corner of Forest and Carbon. In 1916, the Central School burned. Luckily, a new high school was already started at the location of the present high school. That high school also burned in October 1964. Dr. Robert Hatterline was president of the school board at the time.
I was in a meeting in a school meeting to be in Topeka, and I came home about midnight, and I just got to bed and the telephone rang, and it was Mrs. Taylor, Ted's wife. And she says, if you look out your front door, you'll see that the high school's on fire. Ted Taylor got everybody together, every carpenter that he knew and didn't know, some of them knew him, and the lumber yards, and they went ahead and built classrooms in that old gym. We put up partitions up in the balcony. We had school on the stage. It was Ted's fame that we burned down on Saturday, and we had school on Monday.
Doc Hatterline served on the Girard School Board for 42 years. He was also on the Kansas State Board of Education and was president of the National School Board. He played a major role in Girard's educational system.
What they're doing now in the schools is just terrific. They're adding to the, we were the leader in technology of all the schools around here. I think that's the kind of the way people feel about the Girard schools. Heck of a reputation, and that reputation's still there because teachers come in there and know that there is a reputation to uphold, and they like it. They stay a long time.
In 1998, Lawrence Paul Wilson, a former resident of Girard in the 1920s and 30s, wrote about life for Negroes in Girard during those years. Quote, "We had electric lights and indoor plumbing. The schools were integrated and excellent all the way through high school. Many of the Negroes came to Girard from the south to work in the mines. There were about 200 to 300 Negroes living in Girard at the time. For a Negro boy growing up in a white community, things could have been better if we had been allowed to participate fully in all phases of life in Girard. Even into the 1960s, Negroes were not allowed to swim with whites at the Girard swimming pool. There was not a Negro in town who had an office job. The two best jobs were as janitors at the post office. There is not a single professional Negro in town unless you count the preachers. Nevertheless, nearly a dozen went on to complete college." End quote. One of the well-known stores located on the south side of the square after the turn of the century was Sauer's Department Store.
Well, my granddad started it in 1908, and he was a traveling salesman selling men's hats. And so he was buying, run across these in his journey, he would buy the distressed merchandise or closeouts or whatever, and would bring it back to Girard and would rent a place and open it up on the weekend. And that turned out to be pretty successful for him. So he just decided, I'll make this merchandising my full time and drop the traveling business. And so it just gradually grew and grew. Oh, I guess it was back in 30s they started. There's my dad and two brothers, Joe and Eugene, so Eugene, I don't know the date, but he finally left the business and started his own down the streets, selling appliances and having appliance repair. And the stores were open until about 9 o'clock at night, but sometimes in our store we didn't get out of there until 10 o'clock. I mean, you know, people kept coming in, and so we didn't want to chase them away. And but a lot of people just would come and park on the square and watch the people walk by, or they would walk around themselves and visit. And so it was just kind of a social event, you know, Saturday night.
Girard was a busy, busy, busy place. Had a couple pool halls, and it was just fun to be in, like on Saturday night, people coming in and visiting on different corners of the square. Farmers maybe hadn't seen each other for 6 months or maybe 6 weeks or maybe 6 days, but they found somebody to talk to.
When television came on and people, you know, got a set, they stayed home and watched those Saturday night movies or shows, and they didn't come to town.
Another business that got started in the 1930s was John's Jewelry.
My dad moved here from Frontenac, which is anyhow, there was not a vacant building anywhere on the square or any of the side streets. We had to wait, and then a building down in the Sauer's apartment building opened up, and that's where we moved to. But the town was that busy. It was a good town, still is. It's hard to explain what's happened, because it was a busy little place. The theater, we had 2 theaters, one on the east side, then the new Cozy that was just built. And the CCC camp was up there, and they brought the guys in trucks once a week, I think. It was, I think that's why I don't remember anything. I was too busy snooping or whatever, you know, just, but it was, still is, but it's just different times.
About the same time that John's jewelry was getting started, Ivan Brenneman came to Girard.
He was just looking for a locale to put in a parts store, and he had two brothers that had parts stores, one in Columbus and one in Parsons. So there was, the three brothers had three parts stores. We moved here and started business in the middle of the block, right from where we are, this present location, in September of 1935. Actually, it was in the middle of the block until my brother and I took it over, and that was in 1976, and we moved to this location where we're sitting in 1977.
Ivan was involved in many things in Girard. He was an entrepreneur involved in many local businesses and organizations.
He and Jack Shireman were sitting over at Eastside Cafe when Nellie Whitkey owned it, and dreamed up the idea that we needed an assisted living facility, so that's where Westridge was born, was over at the coffee table.
As Girard changed, the printing industry began to play a part in our development.
Vaco High kind of got it started. It actually came over from the Parsons area, because that's where Doyle came from, and he was the instigator, you know, the main instigator of it. He broke off of one of the printing companies over there. In probably a 60-mile radius, we had probably an existence of maybe 13 printing companies, you know, give or take, around this area. Per capita, we probably had more forms going out of this southeast corner than there was in the rest of the world, in the rest of the United States, because it was just phenomenal. We could produce forms cheaper than what they could in their own city of Chicago. Back in the 80s, our phone bills was like $10,000 a month. Well, you take Apico's would be the same way. So the phone companies benefited, the power companies benefited, the city for lights and water and servicing and everything. I mean, I hated to see it go. To this day, I don't know that we've replaced it, you know, because there wasn't too many people in this town that wasn't touched by the printing industry in one way or another. They either had a husband, a wife, a brother, a sister, somebody that worked in in one of the printing companies around here.
I think Girard we've gone from the socialist roots, we've changed along with our economy. Some things for the better and some things maybe not. I see Girard as, I don't believe that we're ever going to grow into a metropolis, and that's fine. I don't think that's our calling. I think to stay a community, that's kind of the ideal of J.A. Wayland. He loved Girard. He called it his home and said he was very glad he had moved here. He was accepted here. And I think that's what, I hope what people want when they move to Girard is to find a home, to find a community, and hopefully, of course, economically, there will be jobs available.